Hey, it's Robert Phoenix here with the Friday FARcast. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being patient and waiting around a little bit. I am joined today with my guest, Tessa Dick, who is an author, a researcher, and she's also the widow of the late Phillip K. Dick. And it's Phil's birthday. On Monday, Tessa? Is that right? Is it Monday?
Yes, December 16th, also Beethoven's baptism day.
Interesting. Phil was born in 1928. Going a little ways back, and there's some very interesting people that were born during that year that had kind of an immense impact on culture in ways that, looking back on the 60s and the 70s, we can begin to understand. So joining Phil being born in 1928 is also Vidal Sassoon. And Vidal Sassoon may seem kind of lightweight in terms of, maybe Phil's contribution to literature, science fiction, etc. But he was a game changer in terms of hairstyles and basically, set the kind of world on fire by working with people like Twiggy and was a major culture shifter. Also, the French film director Roger Vadim was also born during the year of 1928. Of course, he gave us Barbarella, kind of an interesting camp sci-fi movie, which sort of gave birth to the career of Jane Fonda. So let's see who else. We got Vidal Sassoon. We have Roger Vadim, Desmond Morris, who is a pretty well-known anthropologist and writer. I believe he wrote the book The Naked Prey, which was turned into a very, very popular movie. The American science fiction illustrator Frank Frazetta was also born in 1928. So it's a very interesting year in terms of people coming in. Frazetta revolutionized comic book art and comic book illustrations. Ariel Sharon, who wound up being one of sort of the great despots of the 20th century as Prime Minister of Israel, also born during 1928. And Fats Domino, who was one of the early sort of progenitors and creators of rock and roll, also born in 1928. So what do you think about that, Tessa? All these really interesting people kind of dropping in during that year.
Very good year. Oddly enough, my father was born that year.
Oh, really? Well, without your father, we wouldn't have you, and we wouldn't be doing this YouTube cast today. On the dark side, potentially, James Earl Ray was also born in 1928.
Yeah,
So,
but he said he didn't do it, and Dr. King's family believed him.
I said potentially, right? Because I don't believe he did it either. Some other people born during 1928, Patrick McGoohan, the creator of The Prisoner. How about that? He's a 1928 birth. Let's see. Definitely on the dark side is a big new Brzezinski, born in 1928. Mr. Rogers, born in 1928.
I'm expecting you to say Kissinger, but maybe he's even older than that.
On a contemporary, sort of a contemporary authorship, sort of plane, Maya Angelou, born 1928.
Whoa.
Yeah. Let's see, who else do we have? And I'm only up to April at this point. These are all people that were born between the beginning of the year and the end. Shirley Temple, born in 1928. How about that?
All of them about a year before the crash.
That's right. Yes. Yep. Maynard Ferguson, the great jazz trumpeter, born 1928. Pancho Gonzalez, the great tennis player, 1928. Billy Martin, the tempestuous manager, of the New York Yankees, also born in 1928. Kind of in the Bay Area, right around where Phil was living. Agnes Varda, the filmmaker. Did Phil know Varda by any chance? They were kind of in the same area.
I don't think so. He even went to the same school as Ursula Le Guin, but they never met.
Oh, that's interesting. So Varda was born in 1928. The Doctor of Death, Jack Kevorkian, born in 1928. Ruth Westheimer, the sex little sex shrink, born in 1928, and we're only up to June. How about that? It's an amazing year for people that really changed the culture. Martin Landau, born in 1928. Eric Dolphy, Jean-Marie Le Pen, born 1928 as well. Let's kind of fast forward so we can get up to Phil's birth month. Let's see what we have here. July. I'm always fascinated by birth and time. Man, there's so many people born during this time.
Get born in July or August.
Phil, I got Phil for he's a Sag, right? So let me Bob Cousy, the great basketball player, Jimmy Dean of Jimmy Dean Sausage, Lena Wertmuller, the great director, born in Nicholas Ray. A lot of great directors born during this year, 1928. Let's see. I'm only in August. Let me fast forward to December. Let's get into Phil's month here. Okay, Noam Chomsky, born on December 7th, just a couple of weeks before Phil. How about that?
I think he's still alive.
He is. Chomsky is still alive. Dick Van Patten, the actor, Dan Blocker from Bonanza, born in the same month as Phil. Let's see. Here we go. Phillip K. Dick, December 16th. And then in the days that followed Phil's birthday, let's see, who do we have? Anybody interesting? Bo Diddley. So we have Bo Diddley and Fats Domino born in the same year, and Bo Diddley born just a couple of weeks after Phil. How about that? Did Phil have any appreciation of rock and roll?
Oh, Phil, yeah, he liked all kinds of music. He'd play the Missa Solemnis and then put on Jimi Hendrix or Janis Joplin. And of course, he always had crushes on women like Linda Ronstadt, Stevie Nicks, Pat Benatar.
Pat Benatar. There's a kind of a type there. I'm sensing a bit of a type, right? It's a very short leap between Linda Ronstadt and Pat Benatar. They're both about the same height. You know, so they both at certain points sport that kind of semi-butch haircut. You know, very interesting. And Stevie Nicks, very, very different. Very different. Let's talk a little bit about how you and Phil met. And you know what sort of drew the two of you together. Can you recount this magical moment when your star-crossed paths converged?
Well, I was not trying to quit smoking then, but I had to light one now. I'm using hypnosis tapes. Everything else has failed. And I kind of like to breathe.
Yep.
It seemed like mere coincidence, but Phil was sure that it was some kind of a setup, and maybe it was. I think his girlfriend had dumped him, and he was clinging to her and wanted her back. And I think she was trying to find someone else, anyone else. And she actually invited my mother to this party. Now, Mom was still married to Dad, but I guess Ginger knew that Mom was monogamous. Well, Mom wouldn't go, didn't want to, and Mom was still on the phone, just on the spur of the moment, I said, I'll go. I had nothing else to do. And so I didn't drive, so Ginger came and got me. Mom couldn't be bothered to drive me. She was the devil's sister. It really was. Anyway, Phil was at the party and he was pouring drinks, Jack Daniels and Coke. And I told him to make mine weak because I didn't drink.
Mhm.
Hushed. Well, I took one sip and poured it out on the lawn because it was too strong. And Phil was angry at me for wasting good Jack Daniels, but I still hate Jack Daniels. I like Canadian whiskey. It's smooth and nice, and you can sip it almost like brandy.
Right.
Bastard.
Yeah, yeah. The Jack Daniels has a distinct, how shall we say this, effect on not just the palate but the spirit. Right. Jack Daniels. When I was drinking, and I did occasionally cross over into Jack Daniels country, my experiences tended to be a bit on the wild side, shall we say.
Well, anyway, Ginger got too drunk to drive me home. And Phil didn't have a car, so he called Tim Powers to come get him, and I rode with them. And again, on the spur of the moment, decided to stay with Phil for the night. Didn't leave for 5 years. In fact, I didn't leave, he left me, and he hired a moving van, took all the furniture to his new apartment, and then told all his friends this sad story about how I left him. And they believed him. There he is with all the furniture in his new apartment, and they believed. Yeah. I did leave one time. He kicked me out, so I spent the night with my parents.
Mhm.
Yeah. Actually,
So,
his dad and his second wife, Mom, had left him by then.
where was the party? Was it in the Bay Area?
No, Phil had come down from Canada to live in Orange County.
Mm-hmm.
The party was in Santa Ana.
Okay.
At somebody's house, and I couldn't find it if you asked me. I don't know where we were.
Mm-hmm. Right. So when you first saw Phil, what did you think? Handsome guy, interesting guy, walk away from this guy kind of guy, all of the above?
Poor lost abused puppy dog.
Oh,
Yeah, that seems to work on women.
poor lost abused puppy dog. So he was like a stray. Were you like taking an stray at that point in time? Mm-hmm.
You know, we had a son, and he was a great parent. No problem there. And he had always wanted a son. So maybe that was part of his problem with bed hopping. He had two daughters by different mothers. And his, well, he didn't count wife number one. So Anne would have been his third wife, but he called her his second wife. She had an abortion and told him it would have been a boy.
Hmm.
At the time, you couldn't get an abortion in California. She had to go to Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
Against Phil's wishes.
Mm-hmm.
It was a financial decision. Well, I'm doing something weird.
Yeah, I just threw a picture of Philip here so we could kind of get a visual.
Before that happened, I accidentally tapped the mouse pad. I don't use it. I have an actual mouse because I can't manage the pad.
Yeah, no, I get it. Where was this taken? This is a pretty famous picture of him.
Oh, the background is all blurred, but I would guess that it was probably the library at Cal State Fullerton.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't look like any place where we lived or where he lived.
Mm-hmm. This is an image that seems to show up quite frequently in publications where they're doing stories about him. Now, one of the things I do want to talk about today with you is your own work and some of the things that you're already doing, which I think is, of course, it's connected to Phil, but really worth talking about. Before we get there, I wanted to ask you, like, when did you kind of understand that you were living with somebody who, for all intents and purposes, with the modern DSM, would it be considered like a borderline personality, but also obviously quite touched and gifted in some ways? When did that sort of creep into your awareness?
Oh, very early on. We met in July, around the beginning of the month. And then in September, we went to a science fiction convention in Los Angeles, the con. I had never been to a convention before. I'd never even been in a big hotel. I don't think I'd ever been in any kind of hotel or motel. Anyway, I was worn out by the experience. And when Phil had an interview with his editor, David Hartwell, he told some of his friends at the convention to look after me. Well, they took me to one of the room parties, and the air was filled with marijuana smoke.
Mm-hmm.
By the time I left, I couldn't get my key. Back then, they were real keys that you put in the lock and turn.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't get my key into the door to our room. So Phil assumed without asking that I had been taking drugs, and I'd simply breathed in the smoke.
So you got a contact high, that right? I mean, that's.
I get a contact high. I don't have to smoke pot.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Really care to. Anyway, when we got home, I was exhausted and I went to take a nap. So he thought I was doing heroin.
Mm-hmm.
Could not be convinced, even though I never left the apartment and he couldn't find any drugs. He was sure that I must be shooting heroin. He finally figured it out, but it took weeks.
Well, what was he doing in the interim? Like, was he like, so distracted that he couldn't figure out that you were just kind of buzzing on a contact high?
Oh, tearing the place apart, looking for drugs, bursting into the bathroom to see if I was shooting up. I wouldn't have been able to get drugs if I wanted them.
So what year are we talking about? Give us a time frame here where you guys are going through this dance.
1972.
Okay.
And he had recently been in a drug rehab place in Canada because he tried to kill himself, and the Canadian health system wouldn't cover him and he didn't have any money. So that was the only place he could go. So he just assumed everyone around him was on drugs. They had been in San Rafael in 71.
Mm-hmm.
His house was invaded and torn apart.
Mm-hmm.
See, Nancy had left him in 69, but her younger brother, Michael, stayed on. And, a lot of young people came to the house because they were Michael's friends. So the local authorities thought Phil must be dealing drugs because all these kids were coming to his house.
Right. And this gets into sort of the meat of what you're working on right now, and what you sent to me as part of your proposal with the X in Exegesis, Phillip K. Dick's religious speculations. You get into this And one of the things that you mentioned has to do with the fact that he has this kind of almost faded phone call from John Lennon's hotel suite in Toronto, where they're doing the bet in or the piece in. And apparently Phil was friends with Paul Williams, who was the journalist of Crawdaddy and a number of other publications. And I
Yeah.
guess Paul called Phil up, and then Tim Leary was in Lennon's room at the time. So Paul and Tim Leary have this conversation. And you believe that based on that conversation, where likely the CIA, because the CIA could operate in Canada, were able to tap the phone, and then Phil's life changes as a result of this. Is that right?
I think it was Montreal, but that's debatable.
Montreal. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Montreal.
Yeah, I have to keep looking it up. My memory used to be great, but it's getting kind of fuzzy. Anyway, I think the problem started when Timothy Leary escaped from prison in 1970.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was October. Whatever federal agency, probably the Nixon's Drug Enforcement Agency, would have been looking through phone records to see who had been in contact with Phil.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Leary. Come on, brain. And Phil's name would have popped up because they certainly had John Lennon's hotel room bugged.
Mm-hmm.
At the very least, they got his phone records from the hotel. At that time, there were no cell phones. Portable phones used actually ham radio signals, and they were bolted into your car. There was nothing but landlines, and the hotel would keep track of your calls and bill you for them.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
At the very least, they had Phil's phone number as someone who was potentially a contact of Dr. Leary.
Mm-hmm.
And Nixon had named Leary the most dangerous man in America.
Mm-hmm.
And he did have help when he escaped. Leary ended up touring Europe as some kind of celebrity, and Phil ended up with his house invaded and torn apart.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes Phil would say that they took everything of value, and other times he would say they left valuables out in plain sight. But he always focused on the fact that his financial records and his manuscripts were taken.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that his house was torn apart because I met a college student who had visited him shortly after the break-in and took pictures of it.
Mm-hmm.
And the sheriff, according to Phil, the sheriff accused him of having done it himself, but there's no way he could have done all that himself.
Right. So this period lasts from like roughly what, 70 to 74 with Phil, or did it continue to
Well,
happen?
again was November 17th, 1971.
Mm-hmm.
That date is, it's like tattooed in my brain because Phil went nuts every November 17th.
Hmm.
And in January or February of 72, he was in Canada as a guest speaker at a science fiction convention in Vancouver.
Mm-hmm.
He decided to stay in Canada, thinking he was safe from whoever his enemies were. And he ended up trying suicide and being in Calais, a drug rehab center that was primarily for the First Nations people.
Mm-hmm.
In the US, we call them Native Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And that was all he remembered for years and years. And then in 74, when he was using vitamins, thinking that he was going to open his mind with these special formulas he'd read about, he remembered this lead up to the suicide.
Mm-hmm.
Two men in black suits grabbed him off the street in Vancouver, shoved him into the back of a black limousine, and drove him around, one man on each side of him. And they were talking to him and questioning him the whole time, but he was both drugged and hypnotized, told not to remember. And then he just, 1 minute from his perspective, he was on the street looking for a place to buy aspirin for his headache. And the next minute, he was sitting on the floor of his apartment with an empty water glass and an empty pill bottle next to him. And he obviously did not want to die because he picked up the phone and called for help.
Mm-hmm.
Just going to check. I can't get the chat to load on YouTube, so I can't chat with people until it decides to load the chat.
Okay. Well, I've got a chat rolling, so I'll check in with my chat in a minute and see if people have any questions or anything interesting to say about Phil and our conversation. I ran across an image online, and I'm wondering if this is you and Phil together. Let me see if I can put it up here. I just found this. So is that you?
Yep, that's me and Phil.
Okay. Where was this taken?
This was in front of our Cameo Lane apartment and looking back at our Quartz Lane apartment that we had moved out of.
Uh-huh.
Our neighbor Angel took the photo with my old satellite camera. The satellite was a cheap imitation of a Brownie camera.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
So it had to be, let's see, it had to be after Christopher was born.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we moved in, I was like about to pop.
Mm-hmm. So is the name of the street Quartz? Is that right?
Quartz Lane is the street behind us.
Interesting.
Street we're on is Cameo.
Quartz as a method of transmission, right?
Well, all the streets in that neighborhood are named after stones. There's topaz and amethyst and
Mm-hmm.
quartz and cameo. Cameo isn't a stone exactly, but close enough.
Right. You Cameo shows up as kind of a bas relief stone on somebody's chest in many instances. I do have a picture of Phil as a father, and it's actually a very sweet, very loving picture, and suggests a very different side of him in a lot of ways. Let me throw this up here, and I'm sure you're very familiar with the picture yourself, but other people may not be.
Probably one of mine, yeah. This was after Phil bought me a decent camera,
Mm-hmm.
a Praktika, an SLR where you focus it yourself and set the aperture and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Phil wanted photos of himself with his son, so he posed for these. There are several of them.
Mm-hmm.
In the background, you'll see a portrait of me,
Mm-hmm.
another portrait of me,
Mm-hmm.
an older picture of Phil with a cat.
Right.
But somewhere in there, oh, I see, Phil's kind of in front of it. He had a publicity photo of Victoria Principal,
Yeah.
who starred in The Naked Ape.
Mm-hmm.
I think he was upset that wasn't upset about him posting these photos of other women on the walls.
Mm-hmm. It almost looks like the Dalai Lama in the background. Is that Phil back there?
Yeah, that's Phil, and he's holding a black and white cat. That must have been when he was married to Anne. Down below it is a picture of Phil with Wanda Kendall, a belly dancer he met at the Los Angeles convention.
Mm-hmm.
She gave him her phone number, but after we got home, that phone number mysteriously disappeared.
Gee, I wonder who found that phone number and evaporated it. Must have been the CIA, right, Tessa?
I ain't telling.
Mm-hmm. It's a very sweet picture. So what is Phil's son? Is he still around? What's he doing? What's he up to? What's the legacy here?
He's a fine young man. He's in his 40s. He is writing a novel, but he's even slower than I am.
Mm-hmm.
A great story. He's described it to me, but he's written only a few pages.
Mm-hmm. So some of Phil's literary gifts were passed on to him. Is that right?
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
He's really not interested in being a public figure. He's a very private person.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, and the doc you sent me, one of the things that you mentioned is that Phil believed in that there might be some evidence to support this, that Paperback Writer that was penned by the Beatles and John Lennon is about Phil. Is that correct?
Well, Phil claimed that Paul Williams told him that, John Lennon couldn't get out of bed during the bed, but apparently he was in the background and told Paul that.
Mm-hmm.
Paul told Phil. But I don't know, because Phil made stuff up. I did get to know Paul Williams, and the phone call did happen.
Mm-hmm.
It would have been June 1st of, now I think 1969, maybe 70. I forget
Mm-hmm.
which year. But it had to be the date when they recorded Give Peace a Chance, protesting the Vietnam War.
Right.
Paul Williams was there, and he was the one who had Phil's phone number.
Mm-hmm. There's a really interesting movie. I think it's called The People versus John Lennon. And there's a scene in that movie. Of course, there's the bed in, the piece in. And Al Capp, the cartoonist who penned Lil Abner, has this dialogue, almost like a debate with John Lennon. And it's really like one of these very odd pieces of kind of Americana in history, but it's so fascinating to watch Al Capp debate John Lennon and in some ways almost get the best of Lennon. Have you seen that?
No, but it does sound interesting.
It's really super interesting. And Al Capp looks like terminally alcoholic. He's all red and, he doesn't look very healthy, smoking cigarettes. And then you have John Lennon almost hiding behind Yoko and the covers of the bed. And Al Capp asks some extremely pointed questions and, uses his kind of laser-like focus, which was very unusual to see in some ways. So if anybody wants to, check that out, it's The People versus John Lennon, and you can watch that conversation happen between the two.
So it really happened? It isn't fiction?
No, it's real. The creator of Lil Abner debating John Lennon on a bed in Montreal about the war, about the West, about nonviolence, and all kinds of interesting things.
It's People versus John Lennon?
The People versus John Lennon. Yeah. So check that out.
Got that written down.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about this one sheet, this doc you sent me. Now, this work is available to people on Amazon right now, right, on a PDF. Is that true?
Well, it's just a short preview edition, but yeah, I put it on as a Kindle edition for 99 cents.
Mm-hmm.
If you have either KDP Select or Amazon Prime, it's free.
Mm-hmm.
So
I'll put a link up to that in the show page, so people can go ahead and grab this and get some ideas to what we're talking about. Now, one of the things that you spend a lot of time sort of unpacking here is this idea of logos that Phil seemed to be very invested in. You want to talk about that?
oh yeah, logos. Um, I get slammed for saying it that way. I've always said logos, and Phil said logos, but apparently it's logos,
Right.
short O's in Greek. Um, now let's stick with logos. It's comfortable.
Yeah.
Of course, many people know the Gospel of John begins, in the beginning was the Word. And that word, of course, is logos, which isn't word really. That's a very poor translation. It's more like rational thought or logic in English.
Mm-hmm.
It's much more the word. The Greeks have a word for word, and that's lexi, like lexicon.
Mm-hmm.
That's for ordinary words. This logos is a very special word. It's the word of God. So when John says that Jesus Christ is the logos, and he was with God, and he was God, and not a thing was made that was not made through him. He's making Jesus the words that God spoke in Genesis. The first one being, of course, let there be light.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, God didn't take his hands and mold the universe. He just said it, and there it was. Until he made Adam, and God used his hands and formed him from the clay. But this logos didn't begin with the New Testament or even with the Old Testament. It's a Greek concept that was explored by many great philosophers.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm still researching that.
Mm-hmm.
It's very important in Phil's exegesis that words make our world,
Mm-hmm.
literally and figuratively. Like in Orwell's 1984, everybody uses newspeak.
Mm-hmm.
Change the whole language so that people will not know the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And that has happened with censorship in places like the Soviet Union.
Right.
In Cambodia, all the intellectuals were murdered. Anyone with eyeglasses was killed because they might know how to read.
Yeah. Right.
They're in danger.
Yeah.
I have eyeglasses, but they're for reading.
Okay, that's our secret. That's our little secret. But of course, the world knows now. It's really interesting about logos. Okay, I did a search for logos, and where do you see what comes up? I was looking for like an image. Like, let's try to kind of personify logos, right? What is it? Maybe based on some kind of mythical interpretation. I'll show you what I got. I'll show you what I got when I typed in logos. Let me show you what I got. You ready? This is, to me, it's fascinating. Let me just do a quick screen share, because I think on some level, Phil would get this in a very bizarre kind of way. So give me one moment here.
Let's see.
So when I do a search for logos,
Oh my God.
this is what I get. I get logos. And this is the manifestation, or the perversion of logos into these corporate symbols and brands, the logos of our times.
And they are not even words.
No. No, but we can interpret them as words, right? I mean, we know that this would be Firefox, right? That's a symbol. It becomes a word in our head, or we know that this is Google, or Apple, but this is interesting. I wasn't expecting this. I was expecting more along the lines of what we're talking about, but in some ways it kind of works in a very strange and kind of mutated sort of way.
Wow.
Yeah.
I still have to think when I see a car.
Mm-hmm.
I have to remind myself that the chevron is Chevrolet, not Ford.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Just doesn't click immediately.
Mm-hmm.
I can't tell a Honda from a Toyota anyway.
Well, it's hard, I mean, those in. I'm going to avoid a terrible stereotype here, to the best of my ability. So you get into some very interesting ideas in this one sheet that you sent me, which is actually, I think, 15 pages, if I'm not mistaken. But it's very interesting. And one of the things that you talk about is this idea around entropy, which is this force that is about collapse, but that entropy and logos are part of a dynamic whole. And this was an idea that Phil had, and it's also something that you're extrapolating on and looking at these two theoretically opposing forces as being part of the same model. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Okay, I don't have the document in front of me, and I keep confusing Tacitus with Lucretius.
It's Lucretius.
Okay. They're just names to me. I'm going to need to read their biographies and see images that I can use to make my memory get it straight.
Right.
Lucretius was defending the ideas of Democritus by stating that what created our universe where we live was actually a tiny piece of chaos. That perfect order or cosmos would be just infinite sameness. There'd be nothing to observe and nobody to observe it.
Mm-hmm.
What was needed was what he called clinamen, which was just a very slight tendency of one atom to move out of place and hit another atom. And that's how we got all the material objects in our universe.
Mm-hmm.
Him eventually life. Now, what I'm working on now is the parallel to the Big Bang Theory, in which astrophysicists claim that nothing suddenly exploded and created everything.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you need to understand first that when they say nothing, they don't mean that there is no thing. They don't mean there isn't anything. They just mean we can't observe anything, which is very much like the universe of perfect cosmos in which everything is the same. It's like a blank sheet of white paper everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So there could be nothing before the Big Bang. There could be something. There could be everything or anything.
Mm-hmm.
Because physicists aren't using our normal English language that we understand. But what they can't figure out is why the Big Bang didn't just spew everything uniformly in all directions, creating perfect cosmos, perfect order. No stars, no galaxies, no planets, just a big old bubble of everything that to our eyes would be nothing because we couldn't observe everything.
Mm-hmm. Right.
They try to explain it with gravity, that somehow gravity drew things together, but why wouldn't it just cause the whole bubble to collapse on itself?
Mm-hmm.
There has to be a bit of chaos,
Right.
just a tiny touch, so that objects can form, that little atoms can smash into each other and stick. Now, when Democritus said atom, he didn't mean atoms the way we understand them, with a proton in the nucleus and an electron in orbit. He just meant the tiniest pieces of matter that could not be cut.
Mm-hmm.
That's what atom means. A is a negative, and tom is part of the verb ptomaine, to cut. When I say it, I think of ptomaine poisoning. It makes me laugh.
Mm-hmm.
It's Tomeaein, not ptomaine, which is Ptomaine. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
probably murdering the Greek pronunciation. But I didn't study Greek to speak it, only to read it.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody speaks Plato's Greek anyway.
Mm-hmm.
To my ear, modern Greek sounds like Spanish, and many of the words are the same.
Yeah, it does sound a little bit like Spanish. I wanted to read a bit of an excerpt from this. Uh,
Okay.
and this is kind of bringing this idea of the cross and the T into the conversation. So you wrote, Phil did not know the term dark energy, but he did perceive energy entering from outside our world in the form of information. He
Mm-hmm.
called the source of this information the logos. On page 4, he says equilibrium is achieved by the logos in 3 directions: from behind us as causal time pressure, from above, then the final form, the very weak HS drawing toward perfection, each form. That's in exegesis. Note, HS stands for the Holy Spirit. He saw the logos represented as a gold and red illuminated letter, like a plasmatic entity from the future, arranging bits and pieces here, arranging what time drove forward. The glowing letter that Phil saw hanging in midair in our dimly lit bedroom, and which he called the Logos, was the Chi Rho. It first appeared in history in the year 312, when on the eve of a crucial battle against the Western Emperor, Emperor Constantine ordered his troops to put a Christian symbol on their shields. This is from J.M. Roberts, History of the World, Oxford University Press, 1993. Through common knowledge, we are informed that Constantine saw a cross in the sky the night before the battle at Milvian Bridge on the River Tiber. Under the cross, he read the words, "In hoc signo vinces," which means conquer in this sign. He defeated his rival Maxentius in Rome, thus unifying Eastern and Western Roman empires. However, the sign that Constantine saw was not the T-shaped cross, which has become commonly accepted, the most commonly accepted Christian symbol. Phil was halfway there when he declared the cross was shaped like an X, not T. This is the symbol that Constantine saw before his crucial battle. But then you go on to say here that as we look at the actual crucifixion itself, shape of the cross, T or X, you come to the conclusion that it really is a T. and not an X. And it's funny that I'd get this, because yesterday I was talking about the hanged man, and I was talking about the hanged man as a symbol of crucifixion and being upside down, and that we take for granted that this idea that Christ was crucified in a cross that was right side up. And maybe that's really not the case at all, that maybe he indeed was crucified upside down in the shape of the T cross or the tau cross. But it's interesting that Phil is actually dealing with this actual pictogram or a letter that represents logos. And you really kind of build on this. So this is an interesting point. Have you kind of evolved kind of more ideas around what Phil was talking about and speculating?
Well, I had a thought a minute ago, but it escaped.
All right, cool. Let's call it back. Come on, thought. Come on back here.
It's like herding cats. Peter was crucified upside down. He asked,
Right.
He said he was not worthy to be right side up as Jesus had been.
Mm-hmm.
I think what he really knew, the real reason he asked to be crucified upside down, is that he knew he'd die faster, so it wouldn't be as painful.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so the upside down crucifixion will work if you think of Peter. The biggest coward of all after the crucifixion became the bravest apostle later, because he realized that God was on his side. Oh man, that tickles. My hair is like spider web fine. If it touches my cheek, it drives me nuts. Anyway, the logos, we see it everywhere, but that was funny with the logos.
I know, right?
And there is a Logos Bible software that allows you to search in different languages and things like that. It's too expensive for me.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, but it sounds really cool.
You know, E. Michael Jones, who's been on my show a couple of times, talks about logos and this idea of logos rising, which has become something that he's been extolling as this force in the world, which in a lot of ways gets into kind of what you're talking about here. Let me read this. This is Twin Deities, Twin Universes. You wrote God contained all pairs of opposites. So in a sense, God did not exist because the opposites canceled each other out, leaving that nothing could be observed. In fact, no observer existed to attempt to see God, in the sense that God could not be observed. God was no thing or nothing and did not exist, at least not in the way that we could understand. In order to fulfill the desire to exist, God divided itself into two parts, one containing the active aspects of deity, the other containing the passive aspects of deity, like the yin-yang symbol of Taoism. And each part contained a small amount of the other part. In other words, the active half contained a small portion of the passive, and the passive half contained a small part of the active. This was done so each half of God would remember the other half, since each half had a small portion of the other as a reminder. Since each twin contains the opposite of the other twin, and since God is everything, one twin contains existence while the other contains non-existence. In other words, the active twin exists and contains a small amount of non-existence, while the passive twin does not exist and contains a small amount of existence. Our
That's
universe.
familiar. I think Phil discussed it. What you need to notice also is that the black part of the yin yang is actually slightly larger than the white part.
I did not know that. That's interesting.
They aren't equally divided when it's drawn properly.
kind of like custody laws in Texas. They're not exactly equal.
Well, I got full custody, but Phil was my babysitter.
That's good.
He got to see his son as much as he wanted.
That's good. That's really good.
Well, I knew that Christopher needed his father. He still worships and adores him. So I didn't try to put anything between them.
But that's an interesting point about the black being slightly larger than the white. I'll have to zoom in on that next time I look at the yin yang symbol and see if I can approximate that. That's when did you first run across that and figure that out?
Oh, Phil told me.
Uh-huh.
And I looked at the symbols. I forget which book it was. He had more than one book that actually displayed the symbol. And if it's drawn properly, you can see that the white part is slightly smaller. Anyway, yeah, I think if Phil had lived to see the internet, he'd see logos, or what he called Valis, floating through the internet, dropping bits of information for people to find.
Mm-hmm.
That in this sea of, let's see, porn, political arguments, ads everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Find a bit of real information.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason why they say the truth will set you free. There we go.
Now that you mention it, the black does look a little bit bigger.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. Interesting.
Well, I think what they do is they begin by drawing a black line to separate them, and it becomes part of the black side.
Because of the boundary and the edge, there's just more of it as a result of that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But that's how it's supposed to be.
Right. Interesting. This idea of this, the black and the white and the masculine and the feminine, these twin universes and logos and chaos, and they're very interesting. And I had to look at Phil's chart, and you and I were talking about this a little bit beforehand, and I wanted to bring it up because I think it's a really fascinating kind of reality here. At least in astrological realities. Let me see if I can find this thing. Well, I know I have it on my. Give me 1 second here. So, what do you do? Is there any like formal celebration? I mean, I know that when that people that are into James Joyce have this Bloomsday thing. Like, is there any kind of formal celebration for Phil and his birthday?
Well, it has been tried. There was a 30th anniversary held by his daughters, but they held it on the anniversary of his death,
Mm-hmm.
the 2nd of March, which oddly is the day when he received a letter that he called the Xerox letter. He thought that seeing that arrive was what triggered his memories. And she told me not to let him see it, not to let him read it, to just look at it and tell him about it.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, he did open the envelope and read it himself.
Mm-hmm.
It was just a book review of a book by a socialist all about how America is in ruins.
Mm-hmm.
Natal chart.
There it is.
Phil,
So here, Phillip K. Dick. This is his chart, and when I looked at his chart on Astro theme, okay, I could see that the true node was in the sign of Gemini, and then I went over to Astro.com, they were using the mean node, and the mean node was in Taurus at 29 degrees. So it's a very specific kind of detail to his chart. And in this case, I believe the true node has the right equation here because of Phil's understanding of these twin or parallel realities that he talks about and writes about quite often in his work. So we have the true node in Gemini right here, and I think it's very instructive. And then the other thing that really blew me away about his chart was his conjunction of his sun with the galactic center. Now, in 1928, the galactic center was at 25 Sagittarius, and now it has moved to late 26 degrees Sagittarius over the course of this span of time. So, in a lot of ways, like Phil's life was not his own, right? And he's got Uranus on the ascendant, which is radical. It's it is really disruptive in a lot of ways. And he's getting some kind of consistent radio transmission or download from the galactic center in his chart. It's a very interesting chart. And from a kind of an astrological and literary perspective, it actually makes a lot of sense. I mean, we could probably spend more time on this, and here's the yin yang symbol right here, right in the sign of Cancer. And he has Mars in the sign of Cancer at 1 degree, and also born under the sign of Pluto in Cancer as well. So this yin yang symbol plays a pretty significant role. And I'm looking at this chart, and I think Phil would be a really hard person to live with. I'm sorry. I mean, look, he's got Mars and Pluto in the 4th, and you and I talked a little bit about this. This is not a chart that's built for monogamy. He's got Moon and Venus in the 11th house, and Aquarius, and squaring Jupiter. All these potentialities and the variety of relationship, and very transpersonal in a lot of ways in the 11th house. So it's a very interesting chart. It is not a chart, I think, that is made for like day-to-day consumption. Right? This is Phil, I believe, again, based on his chart and his work, clearly is given over to transpersonal energies. Like his life was not his own in some ways. Does that make any sense?
Oh, definitely. He felt that there were certain events in his life that he could not avoid, even if he foresaw them.
Mm-hmm.
But to the extent that he could avoid bad things, he tried his best. He was a little bit of a precog. He could see a little into the future.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't seem to understand that what he saw was possible futures, not things set in stone.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, he tried to avoid, for example, if he thought he was going to get in a car wreck, he wouldn't drive. But on the whole, he just kind of resigned himself to his fate.
Mm-hmm.
So when he had a dream in which he saw himself lying on the floor in his living room, unable to move, he actually saw his own death. That's how he was found. He was taken to the hospital, and I think he was pretty much gone by the next day.
Mm-hmm.
Kept him on life support for over a week. And so they shut down the machine on March 2nd. That's his official date of death.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, so in March 2nd, that would have put the sun in his 12th house, which is the house of the soul. And also, institutions like hospitals, right? Interesting. And March 2nd is right around 10 about 9-10 Pisces. So that would be squaring off against Black Moon Lilith, not quite in square with Saturn. You can see the psychic function in his chart, by the way. I mean, he's got that Sun Mercury conjunction in Sagittarius, very, very close, you know. So there's, when we get into this really close degree with Sun Mercury, the individual and their thoughts are one and the same. Like it's almost like the potential for, you know, some degree of mental instability, madness, but also at the same time being so connected to thought in a way where, how do I say this, that the individual can become like a channel. And I don't really use it in a kind of the new age sense, but more along the lines of being so receptive to thought that that there is this very interesting potential for integration, while at the same time flirting with this idea that that the individual and his ideas or his thoughts are completely one and the same. And in many cases, that would indicate some form of, you know, description of madness in some ways. But there's also this trine with Neptune going on here, which opens him up to kind of more fluidity, and then also the trine to Jupiter as well. So he's got a grand trine in a kite pattern, and there's also some level of taking responsibility for these thoughts with Saturn up here, and of course the ninth house represents publishing as well. So he had to have some format for him to be able to. I mean, to me, this is almost. And I'm not trying to, you know, deify Phil's existence, but to me, this is almost Moses-like in some ways. Like, you know, having this thing that comes to you and then figuring out what the hell you're going to do with it, right?
Right. And Saturn is the planet of Sagittarius, isn't it?
It's the planet of Capricorn, but in Phil's chart, it's Sagittarius is being defined by Saturn's presence.
Oh, I see. Many interviewers in their articles described Phil as Saturnine. And if I remember correctly, Saturn is two-faced, just like Janus. Two sides, two extremes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, there is the conjunction between the Sun and Saturn, which would also give Phil kind of a very Capricornian sort of slant. So Saturn does play a pretty significant role in his chart. And what's interesting is that if I were to throw some transits in here, which I will now,
Oh boy.
we'll see that Jupiter is currently at 2 degrees, which means that it's conjunct Philip's midheaven, right? So I would expect that over the course of the next 72 hours, especially as we approach his birthday, that there will be some focus on him, and focus on his life, and focus on his career. And obviously, we're doing our part here today with this time we're spending together.
And of course, I just got a notice that my internet is unstable, but I think I got it handled.
Well, as long as you and I are stable, I think we can take care of business.
Yeah, well, we're connected by the internet.
Anyway,
about this moment now or the moment of his birth?
well, now because Jupiter is right at the top, I mean, theoretically, because I do believe that astrology transcends time and space, even though it's defined by time and space. And so we can see this expansion around Phil, his career, his ideas, and his impact on culture.
Oh, yeah. He is being taken more and more seriously.
Mm-hmm. And I'm specifically looking at the, hold on one second. We are specifically talking about like the next really 72 hours, 4 days, because of this transit, which is interesting, at least for me.
Wow.
And what's your sign again? Your Sag rising and
Sun in Gemini, Sag rising, Moon in Aquarius.
mhm. So you and Phil both had Aquarian moons, which meant that you got each other, right? Like that's on an emotional level, you could kind of understand each other in this Aquarian sort of way, which is interesting. And a lot in astrology, the moon conjunctions can often be seen as kind of a harmonic between two people. They kind of just innately understand one another.
Well,
But go ahead.
in numerology, we're soulmates but toxic to each other at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And not the usual woo-woo numerology. It's Glynis McCants. She based it on what she knew of Pythagoras.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of made sense to me.
Well, this is not the chart for somebody who is here for deep interpersonal relationship and domestication. I'm just telling you right now. So you were probably one of the few people that could actually hang with him based on your chart and some of these, interfaces with your Sag rising and a lot of his Sagittarian planets likely in your first house. And even with Saturn there, like in a lot of ways, you're carrying on this legacy, this Saturnine legacy, the commitment, right? Because that's what Saturn represents, is a commitment. Very interesting stuff.
Well, I'm capable of being faithful, but I don't want a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
When he started seeing other women, I said, go ahead, but if you want sex, you better take me to dinner and a movie.
That's a very Aquarian moon kind of way of dealing with that. You see what I'm talking about there? I mean, you're able to say, okay, well, go do your thing, but at least treat me like somebody that's worthy of your time, attention, consciousness, and let's make a date out of it. I like that. That's really good.
Respect, a little caring.
Right. Right. Not asking for a whole lot. It's a very interesting chart, and one to me that kind of screams psychedelic prophet in some ways, especially with all this ninth house activity.
Oddly, he had most of his psychedelic experiences without any drugs at all.
I can see that. I mean, Neptune plays a role there, right? With that's harmonic with the Sun and Mercury. Neptune tends to be, very transcendental in a lot of ways. I could totally see that.
Yeah, when he wrote the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch,
Mm-hmm.
people thought he was using LSD, but at that time he had only read about it.
Mm-hmm.
It was sometime later that his friend Ray Nelson got him some LSD from the experimental lab at UCLA. And Phil took it twice, and the second experience was so horrible he wouldn't touch the stuff anymore.
Mm-hmm.
He thought he was a gladiator about to go into the arena in the amphitheater, and he didn't want to die.
Right. Interesting. Was Logos on his side that day, perhaps? Let's hope.
He was speaking Latin. Now, Phil claimed he didn't know any Latin, but I find that unbelievable because of his interest in classical music.
Mm-hmm.
He listened to Latin masses, if nothing else,
Interesting.
librettos. But according to Ray Nelson, who actually studied Latin, his Latin was too good to be just that he picked up a few words.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, being connected to the Galactic Center might have allowed him to open his vocabulary to some extent. I asked you this question before, and I want to revisit it again because I can't remember what your answer was. By the way, this is, I think, the third time that you and I have done something together. You were on my Blog Talk radio shows a couple of times. But the question I asked you is that Phil Phil's works have been widely distributed, widely republished, and turned into other forms of media, specifically movies like Minority Report and Blade Runner and so on and so on. Most recently, The Man in the High Castle on Amazon. Tessa, who's making money off of all of this? Where's the money going?
Hollywood and lawyers. His children do get a little. I don't get anything because we were divorced.
Mm-hmm.
But no, it's rare to find an honest person in Hollywood. They'll offer you a share of the net, but there never is any net profit.
Right.
So
Yep. After they take out all their expenses, right?
Oh, it's horrible.
Yeah.
Way, the one bright star in all of that is the movie Radio Free Albemuth.
Yeah, you talked about that the last time we talked, and you really liked that movie, and that it also maybe had some kind of fiduciary kind of relationship with you as well.
No, I don't get any money.
Okay, but you really liked it though.
They sent me a free DVD and a copy of the book that is a companion to the movie.
Okay.
Really cool. But no, I don't get money from that. The thing is, not only were they faithful to the text, they got it.
Mm-hmm.
They actually made many changes, but you have to change things for movies.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to compare it to A Scanner Darkly, which was literally faithful to the book, but they didn't get it.
Mm-hmm.
They got that drugs are bad, but not that the war on drugs is bad, which was Phil's point.
Mm-hmm.
But Radio Free Albemuth gets the point that, as the fans keeps reminding me, the empire never ended.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same empire with different faces and different names.
Right.
But, Nazi Germany is nothing new.
Mm-hmm.
Stalin's Russia was nothing new. Now,
Mm-hmm.
traced it back to Rome, but I trace it farther back to Babylon and Persia and India and China.
Right. Right.
It's all the same idea that the big man with all the power can control everybody down to the most minor details of their life. Reminds me of my mother.
We started this interview today with the Devil's Sister, and and here we go. We're circling back to her.
Yeah, I just as an example, I'd be washing the dishes, and it didn't matter so much whether they got clean.
Mm-hmm.
I had to do everything exactly the way she did it. The direction in which I moved the sponge was wrong. The fact that I poured the soap in while the water was running was wrong. Everything was wrong, and it didn't matter if the dishes came out clean. It had to be done her way.
Right.
Yeah, well, fortunately, before I had a chance to kill her, she killed herself. I was really ready to.
Wow, that's a heavy indictment.
Yeah, well, she was terribly abusing my son.
That's not good.
No.
That's not good. Changing subjects a little bit, Steve and Chris from Logo Sophia were chiming in the chat room, and they were asking about or talking about how Phil had a twin that died, twin sister. Is that right?
That's right. Oh, we should have covered that sooner. Yes. Phil is buried in Fort Morgan, Colorado, in the family plot in a double grave next to his twin sister, Jane, who died at about age 6 weeks. They were very tiny twins. Phil was barely over 2 pounds. His sister was smaller. Born at home in Chicago in the winter, And their mother got them to a hospital as soon as she could.
Mm-hmm.
But Jane didn't survive, and they didn't think Phil would either. So his father bought the double plot in the family section of the graveyard in Fort Morgan.
Mm-hmm.
And Phil beat the odds and survived for 53 years.
And how old was Jane when she died?
About 6 weeks. They were born December 16th, and she died in, I think, early February, somewhere there.
You know, there's this idea, this esoteric idea that when a twin dies, and especially that early on, that the spirit and the energy of the twin enters the other, the surviving member of the twinning. And this was talked about in relationship with Elvis Presley, who also had a twin and died. Now, there's some idea, there's some weird thoughts that maybe even Elvis's twin might have been killed in order for this to actually happen, but there's no evidence around this. But did Phil ever talk about that potential of his sister being part of his essence and biochemistry in some ways?
Well, he thought that her spirit communicated with him somehow.
Mm-hmm.
He was hoping that she would be reincarnated so he could meet her as an actual person.
Mm-hmm.
And some people have claimed to be his reincarnated twin sister.
Mm.
I'm on the fence about that being even possible.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
I don't see enough evidence, but it would be nice.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But, he really missed that other half of himself terribly.
Mm.
And you find twins in his writing.
Sure. Yeah, it's even in his chart with that 0-degree Gemini true node. So it's a part of his astrological codex. Let's see if we have any questions from people in the chat room, shall we?
Okay.
So, did anybody have a question or two for Tessa today?
Are they chatting here or just on YouTube?
Just on YouTube. So, Maka says, "Sorry about your mom, Tessa. I feel ya." So you've got some camaraderie there in the chat around your issue with your mother. So this is a good time for you guys. Oh, she said thank you. There you go. Tessa's in there. Any questions from the realm of Chatlandia for Tessa?
I'm surprised that Oswald is here.
Yes, he is.
Should be asking questions.
Yes, he's a very inquisitive young man.
Yes.
In a good way.
Mm-hmm.
In a good way. Let's see, Ralph Winter. He says it's a hard thing to find an honest person in Hollywood. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, okay, so here he is, right on cue. If Phil were alive today, where do you think he would want to live?
Oh, I think he'd want to be on this mountain. He kept talking about how he needed to be closer to the sky.
Mm-hmm.
And living in the mountains would be ideal. Clean air, not all that smog.
Mm-hmm.
I'm on the lower part of the mountain. We are not a ski resort, but we got a big load of snow a couple weeks ago.
Nice. Was it the real stuff?
Trees were breaking, some through branches and some just keeled over.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody got to have Thanksgiving. Some were snowed in for a week.
Mm-hmm.
I'm one of the lucky ones. My oak tree dropped 3 branches and they just brushed the eaves of my roof.
Mm.
So I can't open my back door, but I don't need to.
Good. Well, good. You are lucky. Steve and Chris asked a question a bit earlier. They're asking it again. Are you familiar with Eric Davis, the writer, researcher? Do you know Eric's work?
I recently read something of his, and if I recall correctly, I disagreed with him, but I can't remember the details.
Okay, so the question is that Eric Davis says that Phil has his the pink light moment, right? And where he gets the download and sees the future, et cetera, et cetera. Eric Davis, I believe, and again, I have not read this, but this is what Steve and Chris are saying, that Phil had a number of different versions of that moment, that experience that he was able to share with people, and it just didn't happen, or at least his telling of it just didn't happen in one way. I think that's what they're referring to.
Oh, yeah. Phil exaggerated, embellished, and made stuff up. I think I commented on Eric Davis's article something like, "Do you believe everything you're told?"
Mm-hmm. Right.
Oh, I think it was about Phil's hospitalization, supposedly for drug abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Phil told the doctors he was taking 1,000 meth tabs every week. And I said, don't you know he would have died on the first day? He had
Right.
high blood pressure. He wouldn't be alive to tell that story to the doctor.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, he had methadone. It was prescribed by his psychiatrist.
Mm-hmm.
And first by his GP for weight loss. He'd gotten chubby. This was before I met him. I think he was married to Anne or Cleo at the time. And it
Mm-hmm.
became a lifelong habit. And eventually the psychiatrist was prescribing meth for depression before we had all these wonderful mood elevators that make you totally crazy.
Right.
Worse than meth.
Right.
Anyway, but he wasn't taking 1,000 tablets a week. You couldn't get 1,000 tablets.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway,
That's a lot of meth.
many different stories, but he didn't get the download from the pink light or the fish sign. He got it after seeing that Xerox letter and while taking all those vitamins.
I want some of those vitamins.
I lost the audio for a moment. Yeah, well, it was mostly vitamin C.
Mm-hmm.
And oh, I didn't lose the audio. YouTube's behind the
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a little bit of a lag time there.
distracting, but I want to see the chat.
So there was another question, which was, did you see A Scanner Darkly, which I believe we talked about. You have, right?
Yeah, I have the DVD. I had to buy it for myself. I couldn't go to the premiere because his children all got tickets to the premiere for themselves and their friends, but my son got only one ticket, didn't even get to take his wife. So I'm not sure that he went to, yeah, he went to the one for Minority Report.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, A Scanner Darkly, as I said, it's faithful literally to the text, but they don't get it.
Mm-hmm.
Radio Film, they actually made a lot of changes, but they get it. They saw these, patterns that happen in history and portrayed it happening to Nick Brady and his friend Phil Dick in the 20th century. And this satellite Valance that's supposed to save them gets destroyed by a rocket, but there's another one on the way. It'll just take a while to get here. The
Right.
thing is, we can't wait around for a savior to come and end the world in this huge war of Armageddon. We have to do what we can in our lives
Yeah.
for liberty, for humanity.
It's a salient message, and timely too. One other question here before we sign off today. This comes from Theobald, and Theobald asks, "Are you familiar where in Valis Phil switches the sex pronouns when referring to his cats and dogs? Are you familiar with that?"
Oh, yeah. Phil talked about how so many ordinary people, mostly men, just call all dogs he and all cats she.
Right. Yeah.
Projection, women seem to be more feline and men seem to be more canine.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's kind of true.
It is kind of true. So what did he do? Did he flip the script and start messing around with different sexual assignations?
Well, gender, I think.
Designations, rather. Yeah. Gender designations.
The thing is,
well, he was ahead of his time, even with that, right? I mean,
with your mind in subtle ways, and not everybody noticed. So that's a good catch there. Oh, how are my cats?
Yeah.
Well, Inky made it to almost 20 years old. They're in kitty heaven with their mom, Smokey, who I think was 18, maybe 19. I know when Blackie and Inky were born. I'm not sure of Smokey's birth date. The two Bobs, Bob and Bobby, half bobcat, one just moved in with somebody else and the other came home. He'd been hit by a car or something. He just came home, laid down, and died. So I have Sweetie, who is a feral cat that I managed to catch and get her spayed. But I'm not allowed to touch her, but she eats here.
Right.
And I just rescued a little cat who's got to be part bobcat. She's a wild animal. And she can't go outside till she gets spayed, but boy, she wants out. I'm not going to have kittens again. No.
So, is there any inherent, how do I say this? Steve and Chris asked this as well. Is there any inherent strain or pressure in your world trying to be your own writer, your own disseminator of thought, and obviously living in, to some extent, the shadow of Phil's life? I mean, you can't get out of it. I mean, his planets are in your first house. I mean, how do you feel about that?
Well, I have works of my own. They are not all science fiction, but the most popular books, of course, are about Phil. I have to really basically give away my juvenile werewolf fantasy. I have a science fiction novel. I think, yeah, I have it here. Now, this one people do like, the darkening of the light.
Okay.
I have to switch screens so I can see if it's, yeah, they're here. It's very Phil Dickian. It's surreal.
Turn it on its side. Let's see how thick it is.
Oh, this way?
There we go. Okay.
It's, well, it has references in the back, by the way.
Is this on Amazon? Can people find this on Amazon?
Yes. It has 240 pages, and the art is by Nick Buchanan, who is awesome.
Well, I like that.
Does it for free and won't let me pay him. it involves a chip implanted in a woman's brain that everything goes wrong. And in the meantime, her husband is attacked by aliens and they implant his brain with something. And you
Mhm.
never know what really happened because they're both dreaming. But I think the ending, it doesn't tie up all the loose ends, but I think it's satisfying.
Okay. So that's on Amazon. We've got the kind of the exegesis primer on Amazon.
Yeah,
And do you have other books on Amazon as well?
sure do. Let's
Okay.
see. The most recent one about Phil is Blade Runner creator Phillip K. Dick, also art by Nick Buchanan, turning
Cool. I like
sideways.
that. Uh-huh.
Well, it's thinner. It's about 156 pages. And before that, I wrote Conversations with Phillip K. Dick and got torn apart because it isn't chronological. 183 pages or 84.
Mhm. Right.
It's just conversations I remember. And the first one, actually, it's the second one about Phil. I finally came across my original manuscript from 1990, which got really nice rejection letters. Like Valentine, I think it was Judy Wendell Ray said, "Oh, I love your book. Please send me more, but we can't sell this."
Mhm.
Then I did Phillip K. Dick, Remembering Firebright.
Okay.
The first edition had my artwork, which got destroyed or lost when my computer died.
Hmm.
So Buchanan made this for the second edition.
And Phil sporting the cross on his hairy disco chest.
Nobody calls me. 214 pages. Uh-huh. I forgot to turn off the ringer, so some telemarketer rang my phone.
Maybe it was Phil. Phil calling from the parallel dimension.
No,
Uh,
I think he's moved on.
let's see.
But I
What do we have here? We have. You said Phil wasn't using drugs while writing Three Stigmata. Can you
just the prescriptions. It
prescription drugs?
see after that novel was published,
Mm-hmm.
didn't like it. Like Don Juan, there's only two kinds of people. Well, Phil understood that Don Juan at the end of his life realized that he had missed out on true love by being a philanderer.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and thank you, Ralph, for uh, asking about my cats.
Well,
Zaga is here. Cool.
yeah, it's a good chat. We got a good chat room here.
Yeah, well, I've run into many of these people in other people's chats.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure. Yeah.
Well, some of them, you know, come to my YouTube channel.
Lady Zaga, I believe, was in the Jay Widener chat as well. That I did with Jay about a week ago, almost 2 weeks now. Well, listen, hey, if are a fan of Philip K. Dick, or you know somebody who's a fan of Philip K. Dick, Tessa's got some really cool books that you can give away as gifts for the holidays. So I'll put Tessa's Amazon links in the show page if you're interested in getting some of these books for yourself or for other people. And then I'll also put the link into the Exegesis PDF, which is available as well. And Tessa, you've got your own YouTube channel too, right?
Yep. I think you have to search for Busby777. That's my maiden name.
Yeah. I did a search on YouTube and I found your channel. So that's another way of being able to
Well,
locate her.
search by my name, I get all kinds of other videos that talk about me.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, it works.
Okay. Well, Tessa, it's been too long. I think the last time we talked was maybe around 2014 or something like that, about 5 years ago.
Yeah, I had a lot more cats back then.
Yeah. Well, I still have the same number of cats. Mine have not increased.
Well, mine got old.
Hmm.
Figure 20 years or close to it is a good long run for a cat that
That
goes.
sure is. My cats are almost halfway there now. So,
Yeah, my original cats were feral, so but they weren't quite as afraid of me as the feral I have now.
hmm.
She was born in this house, but the house was vacant, so she didn't get socialized.
Mm.
Yeah, anyway, yeah, they would not stay in the house. You would have thought a tiger tried to claw its way out the door.
Hmm. Yeah, you seem to have kind of an interesting relationship with people and animals that don't want to be caged in a lot of ways.
Yeah, but I do miss my dog.
Hmm. Yeah.
He
It-
made it to about 16, which isn't bad for a Rottweiler.
that's pretty good for a Rottweiler, for sure. That's getting the outer rings of their longevity. Well, I'm gonna pull the curtain on our program today, Tessa.
Aw, it's been good and fun. I wish I could tell you more about logos, but I'm really still researching it,
Sure.
especially how it relates to Valis.
Hmm. Well, good. I mean, keeps you busy, keeps your mind working, and you've got something that you're trying to understand and bring into your life, and that's always helpful in terms of anchoring us here. So, well, good luck to you on your journey to Logos, and maybe we'll rendezvous again when you wrap your head around it some more, and then we can talk a little bit more about that. How's that sound?
No, when the complete book is ready to go, I'll give you a ring or something.
That sounds great. Let's do it again. So have a great weekend, okay? And enjoy Phil's birthday coming up, and you might get more than one random phone call during the next few days. I would not be surprised, and we'll just see what happens, with this Jupiter transit over Phil's midheaven, and to see what kind of exposure he gets and what comes out of this. So, in the meantime, stay warm, stay dry, have a wonderful holiday. Okay.
You too.
Okay. Bye, Tessa.
Bye.